Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I'll be your co host. This is our book discussion with our good friend Derek Dwight Anderson. And he's going to be talking about his latest book, Forgotten Capitals and the Historical Lessons that They Teach. I'll turn things over to Derek in just a moment. But before we do, here is the book you can go check out. It's available now. And I'll let Derek talk about the book. But I did want to mention Derek's written several other things as well. And he wrote a few years ago another really cool book called Improbable Voices, The History of the World Since 1450, seen from 26 unusual perspectives. And if you want to watch a couple of recordings that Derek did about that book, let's see, I think those were done like maybe 3 years ago. Those are also on our YouTube channel. So Derek's going to be talking about his book, Forgotten Capitals and the Historical Lessons They Teach. But Derek, maybe when you're done with that, if you don't mind, maybe just give people a brief kind of introduction also to this book, the Improbable Voices one, because that's a really, really cool work that you did. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to our good friend Derek, and he's going to be talking about Forgotten Capitals. Derek, take it away. It's all yours. Let me stop my share. And it's all yours.
Okay, let me share. And I'll do this. And can people see the screen?
Oh yeah, it came up okay. It's not in the screen share. It's not in the
Share mode.
slideshow mode just yet. But it did come up okay there. Oh, there it is. Perfect.
There it is. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Brad. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Patty, for inviting me back. It's really great. Last time I praised the group for the seamlessness with which you moved between, the in-person world to the virtual world. Now I see that you've moved back and that you were able to offer both. And I think that that's a great tribute to the leadership and to the membership of the group, because organizations that are flexible stand the test of time, and I really applaud you for what you've done. I also want to thank all of you for coming. I know that there's a lot to do in Washington, D.C. on a Saturday afternoon, even a chilly one, and that you're here and interested in talking about history impresses me no end. I thought I might begin this afternoon telling you a little bit about myself and my journey as a world historian, both as a teacher and as a writer. I'm going to do this because whenever I attend book talks by other people, I appreciate learning about who they are as authors beyond what's just on the written page. And I hope that this is a wise choice for this particular audience. If I've missed the mark, I apologize. I do promise we will get to some nitty-gritty history in just a moment. History has always been a keen interest of mine. I remember being given this well-illustrated U.S. history book on the left in Christmas in 1970 when I was all of 8 years old. And my father inscribed it in hope that this will still be a story worth telling your children. Not to be outdone, my mother gave me the book on the right that same Christmas, and she inscribed it, "So you never forget that U.S. history is only a small part of it." Yes, my parents had issues. Despite their proclivity for competition, I was clearly raised, however, in a household where books mattered, where ideas mattered, and where history mattered. And then history came so much more easily to me than things like math and science and foreign language. It was easy for them to kind of encourage me in this around history. And I think that they'd both be delighted to know that I'm speaking with all of you today. In high school, I was given two influential books. The first was this book called Book of Marbles. It was originally published in 1937. And it's essentially a travel history. It's the places that you should go and a little bit of the history about those places and the historical reasons for visiting them. It uses the maps that I think were the inspiration for Raiders of the Lost Ark maps, if you remember those. And I, at the time, was able to imagine myself visiting a variety of these, mysterious magical places, like Machu Picchu and Angkor Wat and Hagia Sophia and the Taj Mahal. And while it took me, several decades to visit them, I have been able to see many of these, and I'm grateful for that experience. The second book that was influential for me in helping to build my understanding of world history was a book that Robert and I talked at some length about, actually, the first time I spoke um, with Washington, D.C. History and Culture. And it's Michael Hart's ranking of the 100 most influential people in history. It was published in 1978 originally when I was a high school sophomore. And this early exposure to figures who were not American was really quite influential. That so many of Hart's top 50 are not political leaders or military leaders. Instead, that they are religious leaders and scientists, still strikes me as being quite evocative and provocative. That Muhammad was listed first made me think about history from a non-Western perspective. After high school, I studied modern European history at Bates and at the University of Edinburgh. My first teaching job was at the Macaulay School in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where I taught American history. And then I came to Marin Academy in the fall of 1989, where I've taught a variety of world history and other kinds of courses. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to fast forward to 2012 when I was teaching a world history course. This book, The History of the World in 100 Objects, was written by Neil MacGregor, and it takes 100 objects in the British Museum from their fantastic collections and weaves them into a wonderfully compelling portrait of of world history, of human history. And I love teaching from this book. But on a sleepless night in March of 2012, I lay in bed thinking about my class, about MacGregor's book, and about other ways that a world history course might be taught. People instead of objects were an obvious choice, but how many people and which people? Because so much has been written about the accomplishments of famous people, I didn't see myself as being able to offer anything new in that regard. What might? Well, my first book, Improbable Voices, is the outcome of my attempt to answer that question. In it, I try to explain the history of the world since 1450 by investigating the lives of 26 people who are not household names. I have one figure for each letter of the alphabet and usually 5 for each century. The figures include generals and musicians, aristocrats and artists, businessmen and suffragettes, missionaries and doctors, monarchs and scientists. Each of these lesser-known individuals made a lasting impression on the fabric of history. They too had rich experiences that helped shape the world's past and its present. Consequently, I believe that they deserve to be remembered as well. And so, hence, Improbable Voices is my effort to give a voice to those who've been overlooked for so long. It took me 8 years to research, write, and publish Improbable Voices. And at the end of the process, I found myself really loving absolutely everything about it. I loved visiting grave sites. I loved working in archives and having to put on the special gloves to touch certain kinds of documents. I loved translating really dense academic texts into something that was bit more accessible for the general public. I love designing websites, and all of this was really quite new for me. And so, because I was so jazzed by all of that, it's almost as soon as I finished Improbable Voices, I started working on Forgotten Capitals. Forgotten Capitals continues this mission to try to push readers to reconsider whose history matters and why it matters. And my hope, again, is to shed a little bit of light on the margin and to tell some stories that have been forgotten. Just to be clear, to forget is to fail to recall, to cease noticing, or to disregard intentionally. To forget is to fail to recall, to cease noticing, or to disregard intentionally. Forgotten Capitals is about 9 cities that fall into one of these 3 categories. In all of the cases, they are places that symbolized a region's political, economic, and cultural tensions at a particular moment in time. Significantly, none of the capitals are ghost towns or sites of ancient ruins today. After all, being forgotten does not mean being dead. Instead, these cities remain locally vital. All that has changed is their national and international importance, and therefore most people's knowledge of them. What I hope emerges from the book is a window into our collective history, the lessons that hold meaning for us beyond each city's particular circumstances. The details and the specifics certainly matter, but I think it is in exploring the universalities in the human experience that I hope that readers will find to be the most rewarding part of the book. I say this because of an experience I had just a few years ago. During an expedition cruise on the west coast of Greenland in July 2022, I met this gregarious programmer who consulted with the Pentagon, and he had a really keen interest in history and had read widely about war and economic policy and politics. And he spoke at some length and with a lot of knowledge and detail about topics as diverse as Alexander the Great, Adam Smith, Trump's populism. But as we had these ongoing conversations, I noticed that he struggled to draw meaningful conclusions despite all of his expertise and curiosity. Instead, this once fit football player had to fall back on cliches and platitudes and tropes and truisms. As our week in the ice progressed, I thought about how many other readers of history hunger to put the specifics of what they learn into a more meaningful context. Like my own students, these adults long to find revealing patterns in the human experience, but we labor to do so. We all want to be able to say something a bit more enlightening than history repeats itself or to the victors go the spoils. And Forgotten Capital seeks to help us realize more complex and more personalized conclusions while exploring the experience of 9 cities that have been forgotten or largely forgotten. I hope that that gives you a little bit of background about me and my purpose in writing Forgotten Capitals. And as I promised, now let's dig into some nitty gritty and let me tell you a little bit about one of the experiences I had researching one of the 9 cities, and hopefully that'll help you see a little bit more about my experience as a researcher and as a writer and as a historian. And hopefully it'll generate some conversations that we can all have. I'm going to guess that most of you remember the Bosnian Civil War from 1992 to 1995. And I will tell you at the time that I found the conflict to be incredibly confusing. And I felt really guilty about that. I was teaching AP European history at the time, and I really felt like I should be able to understand this. But each new article I read seemed to confuse me more. And I just couldn't get my handle around what was causing the war, what was the problem. I just couldn't understand how the city of Sarajevo could, in just 10 years, go from hosting the Olympics and being a symbol of unity in the midst of the Cold War to being a completely destroyed city in 1994, just 10 years later. And I'm pleased to say that I hope that I understand it a lot better than I did while it was all unfolding. I am going to guess that a quick refresher might be in order here for you all. If you know all of this, my apologies, but it's really complex. I want to make sure that we all have a foundation. The nation of Yugoslavia, seen here in gray, the lighter gray, was formed in the aftermath of World War I with the goal of bringing all of the southern Slavic peoples together. The Slovenes, the Croats, the Serbs, the Bosnians, the Montenegrins, and the Macedonians. And the idea was to bring them all together as a single country. From 1918 to 1945, Yugoslavia was a constitutional monarchy. And then after World War II, The communists under Marshal Tito and his leadership managed to hold these culturally diverse communities together. But Tito died in 1980, and when he did, the ethnic time bomb began to tick. Civil War broke out in 1992, and by 1995, what was once Yugoslavia had been broken up into the 6 internationally recognized countries seen here. Of these 6, Bosnia was the most culturally diverse, and you can see the percentages of its religious makeup. But what's really interesting is that all of these people were Slavs. They all essentially spoke the same language. They ate a very similar cuisine, with the exception of Muslims and pork. They all dressed in very similar ways. But each of these 3 groups held considerable resentment, if not downright animosity, for at least one of the other 2 groups. Bosnia's Muslims, Bosnia's Orthodox Christians, and its Catholics all saw themselves as being victims of human rights violations that had been perpetuated by and perpetrated by one of the other groups. And so there really was not much of a surprise that civil war broke out when, after the Cold Wars ended in 1990. The war itself was horrible. Muslims fought Croats, Croats fought Serbs, Serbs fought Muslims at different times in different parts of the country. Over 2 million people were displaced from their homes during the conflict, and while the atrocities were committed by all sides, what happened in the UN safe town of Srebrenica in July 1995 remains one of the most potent symbols of the war. Serbia's attack resulted in the systematic murder of approximately 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys, and the rape of untold number of Muslim women. By the end of the conflict, some 37,000 civilians and some 68,000 soldiers were dead. The Dayton Accords brought peace to Bosnia in 1995, but the resulting maps made very little sense. Bosnia was split into 2 political entities, neither of which had a continuous border. The first was Republika Srpska, seen here in white, and it had 49% of the territory, and its capital was Banja Luka. Second was the Bosnian Croat Federation, seen here in light gray, with 51% of the territory and its capital of Sarajevo. Both entities were technically governed by a joint legislature and a presidency that rotated between the 3 major ethnic groups. But the reality is that the Dayton Accords created a partition of Bosnia. Each entity continues to operate as independently as possible. The serpentine lines on the map reflecting Bosnia's multicultural history, its ethnic cleansing, territorial swaps made at the negotiating table, troop positions at the end of the war, and all of this combines to mean that 30 years later, Bosnia really struggles to be a modern, mature democracy with a modern economy. And this is because of all of the overlapping jurisdictions, the vested interests, the residual suspicions, the economic barriers, corrupt courts, and the nation's fundamental constitutional structure. My favorite quote, as one historian put it, Bosnia is a two-headed monstrosity that exists mainly in the minds of foreign diplomats. Excuse me. So how did I develop a sufficient sense of this complicated place so that I felt like I could write about it? In April of 2023, I went to Banja Luka and to the capital of Republika Srpska. Once there, I found the city's 3 most important religious buildings, and what happened to them provided me with a powerful insight into the city and into the nation. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about my experience in Banja Luka and what I saw. The first of the 3 buildings was the Ferhadia Mosque, and I'm going to read now from the book. At 3 a.m. on Saturday, May 8th, 1993, Banja Luka's residents awoke to trembling walls and shattering windows. Perhaps the front lines of Bosnia's civil war had come more quickly than expected, or perhaps Banja Luka had been hit by an earthquake like the one that had leveled the city in 1969. Regardless of the cause, few went back to sleep that night. When dawn broke, Banja Luka's Muslims learned the horrible truth. The Verhadia Mosque, which was built in 1579 and which was widely considered to be the finest mosque in Bosnia-Herzegovina, lay in rubble. Dynamited by Bosnian Serbs intent on a policy of ethnic cleansing and by erasing the nation's multicultural history, Ferhadia's fate soon befell Banja Luka's 15 other mosques. Similarly, Bosnia's oldest clock tower was also demolished. The destruction of these cultural icons, with this destruction of these cultural icons, Bosnian Serbs were constructing a new ethno-national narrative. Because Banja Luka had no mosques, it could be defined as a purely Serbian city. 400 years of a Muslim presence in the city vanished overnight. After the war, about 500 Muslim refugees who used to have lived in Banja Luka returned to the city, and they expressed a desire to rebuild the Ferhadia Mosque using as many of the original stones that they could find. But it wasn't until 2001 that the cornerstone was finally laid, and even then there were protests by Serbian nationals and delays by Serbian officials. Therefore, it wasn't until May 7th, 2016, that the mosque reopened. And it was funded largely by the Turkish government, and they produced a wonderful replica, I think, as you can see here. The photograph on the left was taken by a friend in 1989, and the photo on the right is my photo from 2023, and they've done a remarkable job of restoring the mosque. I purposely timed my visit to the mosque to coincide with the noon prayers during Ramadan, for I wanted to see who came and how many came to that important service. I happened to notice this woman approach the mosque on Banja Luka's busiest street, even though she really blended into the crowd at lunchtime. It wasn't until she turned to cross the mosque's threshold that she paused and put on her headscarf. And this simply may have been a personal choice, but I wondered if she felt unable to be herself in public. Perhaps it was only within the sacred space of the mosque that she felt safe to express her faith. And so for me, Ferhadia, with its carefully reconstructed walls and its single soaring minaret, became a symbol of the ethnic division in this still troubled land. The second religious building I visited in Banja Luka was its Orthodox cathedral. The city's original Orthodox cathedral had been destroyed during World War II, but in 1993, the Serbs saw an opportunity to build something triumphant. Symbolically, the architectural plans called for the inclusion of a campanile that was taller than either Ferhadia's minaret or the original municipal clock tower. It would be, in fact, the tallest building of any type in the town. As the interior shows, the cathedral was meant to be a poignant symbol of Serbian faith and Serbian vision for Bosnia's future. The cathedral would be like rising like a phoenix out of the fire, full of hope and full of grandeur. And it was meant to showcase the wealth of the church and its deep connection to the state. I also visited Banja Luka's Catholic cathedral, which was looking worn and decidedly underfunded compared to the glistening gold of the Orthodox cathedral and the reconstructed mosque. Its clock tower, which was once designed to be an observation deck to look over the city, had been closed for safety reasons, and many of its windows at the top were broken. This made me think that the Croats are a marginalized community within Republika Srpska, and they certainly do feel as if they are. After visiting these religious sites, the State Museum, a number of civic institutions, I had the chance to speak with some Bosnian Serbs in some depth. Because I ate at the same restaurant for 4 nights and had the same waitress and the same bartender all 4 nights, I was really able to engage them in real conversation. The routine that we developed and the growing familiarity allowed them to open up. Joseph's father was a policeman who lost his arm in the war, but he said that Bosnians of all faiths saw the Civil War as being of little importance to their generation. What mattered for all of them was the future and economic opportunity. He was eager to make as much money as possible, and working at the new Marriott, the first international hotel in Banja Luka, was a good step in that direction. Lazarala, a law student specializing in international law, she was more optimistic and idealistic, for she hoped to become a judge who could help end the corruption in Bosnia. She too saw the future as bright and believed that the Civil War, as a part of history, Bosnia's history, needed to be put aside. Let bygones be bygones. Of course, both of these people are Bosnian Serbs. And I did wonder if my waitress and my bartender were Bosnian Muslims who were working at the Marriott, if their attitudes might have been different. Finally, I spoke with a political science professor at the University of Banja Luka, who researches attitudes of young Bosnians relating to capitalism, to the effects of nationalism, and to problems in leadership. And based on our long conversation, it was clear to me that Alexander Jankovic was a particularly thoughtful and insightful man. And what Alexander helped me see was that officials in the Clinton administration in the 1990s approached Bosnia with a binary mindset. Because they were still seeking to solve Bosnia's problems with Cold War sensibilities, they struggled to make sense of a conflict that had 3 sides instead of 2. They really couldn't determine who was on the American side and who wasn't. And this understanding helped lead me to one of my conclusions for this chapter, that binary thinking limits understanding. Instead, it is with nuance and differentiation that promotes real comprehension and lasting empathy. Just as our own lives are complex, history is richly complex. We can't be reduced to easy answers like yes and no and good and bad and us and them. And were American officials in the 1990s able to overcome the limitations of binary thinking and come to a consensus faster, as their NATO allies repeatedly begged them to do, Bosnia would be a much happier place today. The second conclusion I reach in this chapter involves the enormous power of cultural monuments and how they stand as symbols. You immediately know all of the places I'm evoking with these 3 images because they become the embodiment of each of these cultures. It turns out the same is true for the 3 buildings I visited in Banja Luka. They stand actually for more than just symbols of faith. They are woven into the fabric of Bosnia's identity. Collectively, they are Bosnia. Separately, they show the lasting pain of ethnic hatred. And this is why visiting Banja Luka was so important for me as I was trying to figure out Bosnia's complex history. I had to be in the place to develop a better understanding. I had to meet the people. I had to see the sites for myself. And so I hope that this has given you a sense for who I am and how I came to write at least one of the chapters for Forgotten Capitals. It's been a wonderful journey, and I look forward to taking your comments and hearing your questions. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Derek. Greatly appreciate that. Why don't we try and open the chat? And if anyone has any questions, you can put those in the chat. Let's check in with Patty and Brad first. Patty, Brad, any thoughts, comments, questions?
Well, first of all, congratulations on getting to do and understand what it is you really like to do. That is a rare gift. And you embody it with your enthusiasm.
Agreed.
I'm sorry?
I said agreed.
Yes.
Agreed from this end. This is Robert.
Okay. Yeah, I think that might be something that people who are very grounded in their thinking, binaryism is like a common enemy. Um, and I'm not sure I have any insight as to why human beings as a whole tend to knee jerk back to that. But I do agree with you that that was a huge problem in Americans' understanding of what was even for the ones that were trying to understand it, of what was actually going on during the Bosnian Civil War. So thank you very much for expanding on that. And I think your way of focusing was brilliant.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
I have to agree with Patty. You've done a wonderful job of explaining a very complex situation over in Bosnia during that war in a way that we can understand it much better than maybe what the press led us to understand. And I think that's very important. So I congratulate you on this part of the work.
Thank you. I think it's one of the things I struggle with as a teacher of how to bring current events into my classroom. For me as a historian, it's only with the perspective of time and a little bit of distance from those events that we can truly make sense of them. And so I just think that's part of the nature of history, is that we need the passage of time to understand what's important and what isn't, and what has meaning for us.
Yeah, that's the learning from process, right? And that's one reason why we're not that good at it. We get too binary about the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I hope with time, some of the wounds that were caused by that situation have started to heal for those poor people there.
I think there's certainly an energy in the younger generation to want to do that, to put, if Bosnia were admitted to the EU, things would change for the country quite dramatically. And the younger generation is very hopeful that that will happen sooner rather than later.
Yes, other people are thanking you in the chat for helping their understanding of it of the whole situation to expand somewhat. Where was I going? Yeah, curious, as you were speaking about the younger people that you were talking with, I'm not even sure I know how to answer that question. I mean, obviously you were having an engaged discussion. Did you develop any sense of how deep one might, and I don't want to make this sound aggressive, but how deep one might need to scratch before you can see traces of the moral confusion that begat these young people? Does that make any sense to you, what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. I mean, the first night was very professional, and how are you, and where are you from, and it was very polite but superficial, right? And then the second night, a little bit more, and they were really surprised that I came back the third night. By the fourth night, the restaurant happened to be quite empty. The other nights it was much busier. And so they actually sat down and we just kind of talked. And that's where I learned that, she was in law school, and this was sort of a temporary job in between terms. And he was hoping to, make a career with Marriott. And so it's that familiarity. I had this experience once in Venice where I went to the same restaurant 3 nights in a row. And the first night, we were just tourists. The second night we got free bread, and the third night we got free bread and free wine and free dessert because we were family at that point. So I think that part of it is just familiarity and being open to conversation, and that just takes time and exposure and repetition almost.
So the young woman, it sounded like her way of dealing with her awareness of any sense of injustice or how her background has been harmed by it. She wants to go into a line that can help her rectify that. So it's an active part of her consciousness.
Yes.
The young man, I don't, from what you've talked about, and again, this, I don't mean this as a judgment in any way, seems like he is still maybe seeking answers that she has already gotten to.
I think that's a fair assessment. And you know, they were both within the years of each other in terms of age, and I think that that may also symbolize some of Bosnia, that some people are more ready to move on than others.
That's exactly what I was getting at. Thank you so much for understanding that. I never know if I'm making sense. Do you know?
Of course you are.
I think the people who think about these things, a lot of people look at us with kind of crossed eyes to because they can't figure out what we're talking about. But yeah, I kind of figured out at some point along the way that it's the anthropological aspects of history that really teach me the most, and through which I frame my understanding. And you seem to be doing that, a similar type of thing.
Trying to, yes.
Well, it's always a process, right? Everything has to be a process. That's perhaps one explanation for the binary, because it's easier to weigh two things than it is to weigh seven.
Yes, yes. And to sort of address Alex's question about the new administration, I'll admit I'm definitely more on the liberal side of things, but I worry that that some of the people that Trump has brought into office will return to an us versus them kind of mentality in a world that I just see, you know, foreign affairs as being, foreign policy being more complex than good guys and bad guys. So I'm nervous.
Derek, I didn't like is maybe not a good word. I appreciate you including the story about the mosque, because that was really troubling to me. I'm not Muslim, but I mean, that being said, people should have the freedom to worship whoever they choose or not choose to do so. And just really kind of shocking to hear that story. And I know just in America, there's pushback sometimes when a mosque will try and open up in a community. So really interesting to hear that kind of dramatic story. So I appreciate you including that.
Thank you.
PBS actually has a great 3-part documentary on a town in Texas. I think maybe Victoria was where that happened, that a mosque was burned down, and sort of the fault lines that it really brought out in that community. And it's very sobering to really, you know, have that complex look at the different factors involved. And of course, there is no ideally just resolution. And that's, again, perhaps the temptation to want to be binary, because if you try to make all the pieces work, it's much more complex, and human beings just aren't that well known for their patience.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of just, it's pretty disappointing that some people don't have a very advanced level of thinking on that matter.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of am picking up that there's a particular sort of debate trying to happen in the chat, which I agree. It's kind of unfortunate, if that's putting it mildly. Some of us are undergoing some extreme anxiety about it. Wow. You just open up so many.
I'd be happy to talk about, you know, some of the other places that are in the book, if that would be helpful or of interest
Oh
to
yeah, that
people?
would be great.
Um,
Another thing I wanted to chat with you about. I think it was funny because when you were on the first time after you read the previous book, we were like, "Oh, that was really cool. What book are you going to write next?" And you were kind of like, "Oh God, this was a lot of work writing this one. I think I'm going to take a break." And then here you are.
well,
You've written
and
another
here I
one.
am. Well,
So I
you
guess
know,
that leads to the question: what will your next book be after this?
I I actually am thinking about doing a memoir.
Oh,
I
really?
yeah,
Wow.
I think I need something very different. And I
Well, let's see.
was
You could write a romance novel, you
I
could write a
know.
travel book based on all the places that you visited. All kinds of options.
And the next thing you know, the couple's going to meet in a library, right?
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
That's
Ideally in
brilliant.
an room. So
And if
I
anyone's in
would,
the film industry, film rights are available.
I would actually love if you have another capital that you feel would give us
Yeah.
more discussion. Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about some of the other capitals
Could I
there?
share the screen again, or am I still enabled for that?
Oh, yeah. No, you can share it. Yeah, it came up.
Okay. Can people see that slide
Oh, yeah.
of
Hmm.
the world
Yeah. Oh,
map?
that's a cool slide.
Okay.
We like maps.
Yeah. So this, excuse me, this is these are the 9 cities that I write about. And as you can see, I was looking for a geographical distribution. I was looking for a range of chronology. And I didn't want to do ancient cities. I don't quite have that background. I mean, I teach it at the high school level, but I don't have as rich a background in that. So I wanted, to focus more on modern history, and then try to get a real distribution in the world. And so I don't know if there are any of these in particular that people might be interested in. Um, but maybe I'll say just a little bit now about Hargeisa in Somaliland, the last capital, from 2022. Um, just real quickly, what is Somalia today was once 2 different colonial states. There was the Italians, who had the main Indian Ocean coast of Somalia, and then the British had British Somaliland in right out, at the base of the Red Sea. And in 1960 or 61, I'm sorry, the two colonies decide to unite. And it was a disaster, because we were dealing with 2 different political systems, 2 different legal systems, 2 different currencies, 2 different languages. Um, and yes, they were all ethnically Somali, but their history had been so different from one another. And so what's happened is that after much difficulty, the old British colony, Somaliland, has, for the last 30 years, tried to separate from the rest of Somalia. And they've had peaceful transfers of power. They have a democratic system of government, which is, of course, pretty rare in that part of the world. But the issue is that they are not recognized by any country in the world at this point as an independent nation. And what that means is that they cannot qualify for loans for things like the World Bank. They're excluded from international business operations like credit cards. And what I found so interesting about Hargeisa was that the people there have been able to find workarounds so that they can participate as much as possible in the global economy. Um, they're a pretty ingenious group of people who are finding ways to make the system work for them when the rest of the world doesn't want that, doesn't want to recognize them. And a little bit like Bosnia. If Bosnia were admitted to the EU, things would change overnight for the country. If Somaliland were recognized as an independent country from the rest of Somalia, it think it would be, there's some people that think it would become the next Dubai of the Middle East. So, you know, to work with something that was so current and so palpable and try to get a sense for how people are managing in the world, that was really interesting. And I don't know if there are other ones that you have interest in or want to talk about in particular, but those are the countries I chose and the cities
All
that
of them.
I worked with.
Do you think,
Exactly.
I wouldn't expect you to go through each one in depth, but do you maybe think you'd have time to just go through each one just kind of real briefly? Because I know a
Sure.
fair amount about history. I'm not an expert, but some of these places I'm not familiar with myself.
Well, that's the point, is that, you know, they're forgotten, right? So real quickly, Jolo is in the very southern Philippines, right across from Borneo. And in 1775, 1800, it's the Singapore of Southeast Asia. It is controlling all of the trade between China and Indonesia and Malaysia and the Philippines. And its sultans were incredibly wealthy, and it really was the Singapore of Southeast Asia. Well, who's ever heard of Jolo? I mean, but it still exists. It's still a small provincial capital in the southern Philippines. And I was just interested in, well, how, I guess with so many of these things, how does a place go from being so prominent and so important to a place that we don't know of today? The second one is in what is today Guatemala. The highlands of Guatemala attempted to separate from the rest of the country and form a separate state called Los Altos in at several points in the 19th century, but especially in 1838. Fillmore City, this is one that there was an attempt to move the capital from Salt Lake to something that was a little bit more central in the Utah Territory at the time. And they actually start building a Capitol building. And yet, of course, the Capitol ends up moving back to Salt Lake City. So that's my only American example. Rabaul was the capital of the German Pacific colonies. An absolutely spectacular setting with volcanoes and one of the world's great deep water ports. But they were trying to control an area the size of the United States in the Pacific, and doing it from this one island capital. I can talk more about that if that's something that people are interested in. Ingalls is in the U.S. in Russia today. It was a separate ethnic enclave within the Soviet Union. And I'm looking at it in 1936 in the context of sort of the rise of Nazis and Stalin and purges and what's going on in Ingalls. The Japanese invade what's today Manchuria, set up a puppet state called Manchukuo. The capital was known as the new capital, or Xinjing, and they tried to build a whole new capital the same way, like Brasilia was built, or St. Petersburg was built, or Canberra was built, sort of out of nothing, in order to create a new city. Enugu is in today Nigeria. There was an independence movement to try to break away from Nigeria. The eastern part of Nigeria wanted to become a separate country. Many of you may remember the Biafra famine and the Biafra Civil War. And this is a chapter about the experience of eastern Nigeria. Banhaluka we've talked about, and Hargeisa I've talked about. So those are some of the capitals and the lessons that stem from them. Yes, they're sort of obscure places in some ways, but they all teach us something more about ourselves.
I have a question, and a similar question for both of the ones you've covered so far. With Somaliland, you talked about it not being recognized, what are the obstacles and processes that would have to happen for it to get the recognition that it needs?
For Somaliland?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Ethiopia is very close to doing that. They on January 1st of 2024, Ethiopia and Somaliland signed an agreement that would give Ethiopia access to the sea. They would actually grant Somaliland would grant Ethiopia, I can't remember, it's 20 miles of coastline, something like that, and it would sort of be, they'd have ownership of it for 50 years. Don't quote me exactly on the numbers, but that's the ballpark. And with that, it feels like if the agreement does go through, of course, the nation of Somalia, which is the diplomatically recognized country, is fighting it tooth and nail. But it feels like there may be movement, and we may see that in 2025 even.
So the greatest obstacle is the country of Somalia,
Yes.
is what you're saying, right?
There's also an interesting treaty. It's the Treaty of Montevideo. It was passed in 1930, and what it requires is for a country's borders to change, it has to be with the consensus of the existing country. So, Eritrea separated from Ethiopia, but the Ethiopians agreed to do it. Sudan was separated into two countries, Sudan and South Sudan, but that was because the Sudanese allowed it to happen. You can't get diplomatic recognition unless the original home country authorizes it and allows you to separate. That's the international agreement. And so until Somalia sort of gets on board, it's gonna be hard. But
Okay, so a similar question would be about the former Yugoslav countries becoming EU. What are the hoops that would be necessary for that to happen?
Several of them already are. Slovenia is an EU member. Croatia is an EU member. So the richer ones have already become EU members.
What a coincidence, huh?
I'm sorry?
What a coincidence, huh?
Yes.
The richer ones.
And the further south you go, the poorer the old Yugoslavia is, and those countries or nations have not been included. I think what would have to happen. I'm not qualified to be able to say that for sure.
Okay, no, that's a fair answer.
I don't want to mislead people. I don't want to say things I don't know. So, but if somebody else knows something about that, I'd be all ears.
I think you probably hit on one of the major aspects, and I would guess Russia might be a consideration. Russia and NATO.
And because of their connection with Serbia, so there'd be pushback there. I also do think that there are internal issues. I mean, they have to. The corruption in the courts apparently is really quite extraordinary, and that's a judicial issue that would need to be solved. They'd have to agree to certain EU principles on human rights, and I'm not sure that the Serbians, in particular, would want to do that. Republic of Srpska is actually quite happy right now, with some ways, with the way things are, because they're able to, be as independent as almost they could be. But they don't have the diplomatic recognition, and I don't know, when you get different people who struggled with each other for so long, and they all live in a mixed up world, and you can't divide them cleanly. That makes creating nations hard, and that makes gaining international recognition that much harder.
I think I not that long ago, but again, I'm fuzzy, so don't quote me. But it seems like I read. Oh, I know. It was an article about some of the places where some of the fringe media originate from.
Mhm.
And I thought, and again, I could be wrong, I thought Bosnia was one of those places, and that, yes, indeed, that corruption was one of the biggest problems there. That I think it was Bosnia, one of those countries, though, that they'd had 5 different, not full government maybe full government turnovers, like in a very short period of years. And that was partly the corruption. So this young lady that you spoke with, that's basically kind of where her focus is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's where she'll try to go. And
Yeah,
you know, and then the currency is not as stable as it needs to be, and there are the other kinds of minimum requirements the EU has for admission, and Bosnia just isn't quite there in terms of its economy, in terms of its debt ratio, in terms of its other kinds of things like that. So
yeah, the economics in some ways is kind of Wild Westish.
yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I think it was about Bosnia. What is your experience of that? Because, like I say, the way I got to this article was, in discussing or researching some of the quote unquote alternate media. Did you understand that or have that impression of that in your visit there, or is that something that didn't come up?
I'm afraid that didn't come up. But I have to admit, I'm not a linguist. If I spoke more of these languages, I would be in much better shape in terms of making these connections and evaluating things for myself. And so,
What I got from
we
this
all have
article.
limitations. So.
Okay, no, what I got from this article was that kind of exactly what you're talking about. So, and it applies to the countries in this area. So, because of the judicial sketchiness and the economic sketchiness, it's an attractive place for people who aren't necessarily the most idealistic people to use their money to get more money.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think corruption is a real thing, and it's endemic in many of the countries that are not only on this list of the countries I've looked at, but in other countries around the world. So,
well, the more you are on the outs,
yeah,
the more likely you are to be susceptible to whatever works, I think.
Yeah.
Hey, Derek, what about a couple questions? Since you're a professional historian and a professional author, any advice, suggestions, or recommendations for people that want to become a historian and or want to write a book?
I
Like what do you tell your students when they say, "Oh, I really like what you do. I want to be a history teacher too." What do you recommend to them?
One of the things I do in my class is I try to give kids as much freedom to pursue their curiosity as possible. And I try to let them. I let my kids in my world history course study anything around the world in any time period. So it's that flexibility that I think is really what can help somebody who wants to become an author. Is what subcategory are you interested in, and do it. I mean, whether it's the history of technology, or the history of medicine, or the history of ideas, or the history of I don't know, rubber bands. I mean, whatever you're interested in, that can become something that has a history and has a story to be told. So I think the other thing is, so many people do things at the local level. Local history is so important for preserving the stories of people and the impact that they have on communities. Tip O'Neill is credited with saying all politics is local, and it's true in some ways. Like what's happening in your community is a story that needs to be told and needs to be preserved. So I guess my other advice is not to bite off something quite as big as I did with my first book. If I had to do it over, I wouldn't choose 26 cities, one for each letter of the alphabet, but that was the inspiration behind it, and I would have probably been better off if I'd picked, 10 and made it a little bit more manageable book. But these are things we learn, and when you do something for the first time, and yeah.
That's funny because I talk about that in the art history programs I do. If you look at, say, two paintings,
Yeah.
and one of them has like a huge number of figures in it, and the other one doesn't. Not always, but it seems like 90% of the time, the one that has the huge amount of figures was done first. And I think maybe because the painter's like, oh my God, this is a lot of work. I'm not going to have 12 people in the next painting. I'm only going to have 4.
3.
Or you know what? Maybe I'll just do a portrait.
Also, Robert, you guys are making me think of the Toni Morrison quote you like to reiterate all the time. Do you want to repeat it?
It's a great quote. It says, if there's a book you want to, how does it go? It's something like, if there's a book you want to read.
The book you want to read, but you can't find that book, that means you're supposed to write it. I'm paraphrasing, of course,
Yeah. You got
That's
it.
good advice.
Exactly.
Good advice.
Well,
That's what Derek's been doing.
Yeah. Toni Morrison was pretty experienced in the field, I would say.
Yeah.
I think she started writing as an editor, right? At one of the major houses. I don't remember which one, but I'm pretty sure that's where her career in the world of literature actually began. Yeah, I can't imagine what you would be doing if you hadn't found how much you like doing this, because it just suits you, and it's like I envy your clarity, and because not everybody quite finds that thing that they're supposed to do, if you know what I'm saying.
Yes, I feel very fortunate. And but part of this comes out of the curiosity of my students, and they'll ask me questions and I don't know, and then I'll go and try to find out for them, and this ties into my role as a librarian too, where I'm always helping kids try to find resources and answer questions, and every once in a while I get curious about something, and then off I go. Putting the puzzle together of which capitals to do was interesting, and I'm struck with I don't know whether you can see this, but this is one of these books that most libraries would no longer have, Merriam-Webster's Geographical Dictionary, and it's a list literally of places around the world, and just little descriptions of who they are and what they are and where they are, and it's, I don't know, 1,300 pages, and you think about how many websites that would require and how many clicks that would require to go through. But one of the things that I did is I made kind of nomination lists of cities using this geographical dictionary, and I'm so glad that I saved as librarian. And from that, I had lists of abandoned cities, and former capitals, and moved capitals, and I had all these different lists, and then narrowed it down from there. I forgot where this began.
No, but in the course of this, you just reminded me of an article I read. I think it was The Atlantic a couple years ago. The title of the article was "The Rotting Internet." And just as you were going through this thing about you probably couldn't find this in a library anymore, and that you're covering exactly that. There's this assumption right now that nothing ever disappears. And according to this article, the reality is, a lot of things are actually disappearing.
Yeah. And as media is being controlled by fewer and fewer sources, that's only more so.
Exactly. And when you don't have a lot of supervisory controls, it becomes a lot easier to change history, doesn't it?
Yeah. The Internet Archive is if you don't know it, is an amazing resource that does a great job of preserving books and preserving websites to kind of hang on to some of that that past history.
You can see, I mean, it's not that often that a specific article hangs with me for a couple of years. read at least 3 or 4 now that I think of it, because I just remember where I was living when I read it, and that was at least 3 or 4 years ago. So,
Yeah.
wow. The things we don't think about, because it's easier to not think about them, right?
Right. Right.
What about Derek? More of a general question, just general history question, not necessarily. Do you have any particular favorite, like historical figures, like people that you admire, or people that have inspired you, or people, if you could go back in time, you'd meet and ask them some questions? Anybody stick out?
Well, there's one person in Forgotten Capitals that I do admire. His name was Albert Hall, and he was the German governor of the Pacific for about 12 years around, well, 12 years prior to 1914. And he's an interesting figure because he learns the local language. He tries to find that middle ground between the needs of the local people, the needs of the European planters and colonists, and to manage the realities of being so far away from Germany when the German government expects the colonies to be self-financing and self-supporting. And Albert Hall simply doesn't have the resources to be able to do that. And so he's trying to manage the Pacific with its incredible diversity of cultures, that, from the islands to the highlands of New Guinea. And the reason I think I admire him is that and what reminded me, another one of my historical lessons, is that history isn't always experienced the same way by the same people, by people. That, colonialism and imperialism had certain characteristics that were in common to many different cultures, but to say that everyone experienced imperialism the same way, I think undermines and devalues some of the individuality of the human experience and human history. And so for me, encountering Albert Hall was really interesting because he helped challenge this notion that all imperialists and all imperial governors were evil people who were committed to genocide, and he clearly wasn't that kind of person. And that was fun to encounter, somebody who was really trying to do the best job he could for the most number of people in his colony that he could, and that for me was a new experience. Yeah. So I guess currently, I'd love to go back and meet Albert Hall. Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. If anybody in the audience has any questions or comments for our host, Derek Anderson, feel free to type those in the chat.
See if there's anything there right now. Hold on.
Oh, Ellen asked, who do you have in mind for the memoir? I think you were talking about a memoir about yourself, right?
Yes. I'm thinking of taking one very chaotic year in my childhood, 1973, and talking about the moves we made and the people that we met, some of whom were reasonably famous, and some who were, not, and just trying to make sense of that world. I think the 70s are an important transitional decade for both the United States and the world, and one of those that has perhaps been overlooked. Jimmy Carter's death has, brought it back to the foreground a little bit for us, I think. But it's a vitally vital and transitional decade that deserves some more attention. And to try to do that from the perspective of my family experience might be of interest. I don't know. I'm still contemplating and beginning to think about it.
I'm glad you said that about the 70s, because as Robert well knows, we do culture programs too, and disco is not my favorite form of music. And I the most recently remember explaining it to Robert as, well, that period of my history, and I owned it myself, was not my favorite period. So it might have something to put it more bluntly. Yes, I blame disco on the 70s.
Okay, well. Oh, but it's so much fun, Patty, right? I mean, you can dance to it, you can celebrate it.
Yeah, but I was having a little problem with the history myself, so I wasn't that into the music. I think that music was expressing a lot. I thought it was trying to what's that word where you let's not think about that right now.
Yeah.
Let's the big ball and dance, you know. So yeah, and then again, that goes into that anthropological thing, right? I mean, I'm sure somebody has written a book somewhere explaining disco via the cultural waves and
Yes.
disturbances of the time. I just
I don't think anyone has, Patty. I think you have to write it.
no, you want somebody who likes disco. The book might do better.
Yes, you need to come at it from a positive perspective, perhaps.
Yeah, I wouldn't be the right author for that particular one. But I don't know if you were listening when Robert and I were talking, and I was talking out of turn. It wasn't actually right to do it, but yes, there's a particular film I have been raving on and off for years that we really need to show in our particular culture things. And I happened to see it again yesterday, and I'm like, why have we not shown this yet?
What's the film?
The Last Waltz,
Oh,
the
yeah.
farewell concert of the band in 1973, I believe.
Mhm.
My new definition of it, Robert, is it's what was happening between when everybody thought the music died and disco. That's basically
Yeah.
so it's a great, great movie, and you can't stop moving. I told the lady next to me that I had gotten my 10,000 steps in definitely while I was sitting down there. So I'll let somebody else talk. I shouldn't have grabbed it again, but that's what I mean by anthropology and history. And the nexus is where I learn a lot.
Oh no, it's okay. All good.
I agree, Alex, that the GOP and YMCA is a bizarre combination. This is an anthem to young men and sex, and yet it's about it's being taken over by Donald Trump. I don't understand it, and it's one of those things that actually drives me crazy that people are. It's not just that they're misappropriating something; it's that they're completely ignoring the historical context from which it came and when it was done and when it was written, and that's disturbing. I mean, to me, like you listen to the lyrics, and this the lyrics are about gay men cruising in the 70s. It's not anything about
it was a very different time.
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah. And
Patty, you did bring up a good point about how it's really interesting that music from like the early 70s isn't really as well known just because it's after Woodstock, before the disco era, just all the things that came out of that. But anyway, let's get back to Derek. What about any travel recommendations for any of these places that you visited? I mean, you talked about Bosnia, but
I wish
any
I
other,
do wish
and not
I
necessarily
had,
related to this book, but just places in general that you visited that you really liked, or maybe off the beaten path places.
I will say that I wish I'd been able to visit more of them, but so many of these places are the U.S. State Department does not recommend going, and were I still in my 20s, I might do it anyway. But I'm reached that point in my life where I'm not going to go to a place that the U.S. State Department says is not a wise decision.
You get a little more cautious as you get older.
Yes, isn't that interesting? I don't know. I think my favorite trips
Or
that
what's that saying? There's old motorcycle drivers and there's fast motorcycle drivers, but there's no old and fast motorcycle drivers.
Okay, that's fair.
Yes, succinct, I think. Yes.
The trips that I have honestly found the most rewarding is when I've combined a larger city with a lot of museums, and then that's been part of the trip, and another part of the trip has been something that's much more rural and small town, and that contrast within a same country, actually I've found to be really rewarding because it allows you to see, imagine coming to the United States and only going to New York. Well, New York is incredible and has amazing things, and I love it in so many ways, and it doesn't tell you the whole story of the American experience, really, right? I mean, whereas if you went to a small town in Pennsylvania or rural Wyoming, you would see a different side, and that would help. That for me, that helps me understand the place a little bit more.
Oh yeah. Well, even within New York, people that own New York City, and they just tend to think maybe just of Manhattan. There's the four other
Right.
boroughs, and then there's all the suburbs, and yeah, New York City's it's not even representational of the state, let alone the country.
And
but yeah, it's a really amazing place nonetheless.
that's really true of the United States. I mean, we even have adopted phrases for it, like flyover country, but that's one of the biggest conflicts in the United States is the people who tend to live in the most urbanized areas really, I mean, it's one thing to intellectually try to understand a rural area, but it's a whole different thing to live in that environment and in that rhythm and pace and with those concerns. So yeah, I mean, that's a very hard thing for anybody to do.
And with
I-
just using the term flyover country tells you that
Exactly.
it causes a sharp division between rural people and people
Exactly.
urban.
Yeah, that's why I said it, because it is dismissive.
I have cousins who are cattle ranchers in Montana, and what they put up with and what they have to deal with in terms of weather alone is just extraordinary. And I don't know how they honestly how they manage the ranch, because there's so many obstacles and it's so hard. Yeah, it's
I grew up on the East Coast, but so I was among a rapidly dwindling group. I lived on a working dairy farm, a family generational thing. But because I was on the East Coast, I have always, all my life, been aware of things I understand that so many of the people around me have no concept of. And so, yeah, and it gets even more extreme as I get older. It's like, wow, it actually helps me to realize, I mean, that I've been alive going on a century. you know.
so.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah. I do have I'll offer one more thing. There is a critical review of the book that won't be that hard to find. And I think the reviewers misunderstood kind of the nature of history, and I'd love to just see what you all think about this. Review says I've contradicted myself. On the one hand, I celebrate these individual stories, and yet I try to draw universal conclusions about the human experience from them. And the argument is that I haven't, that's a contradiction, that you can't do both. And I think that this kind of gets at what history is. There's some other disciplines that take models and then they find the examples to fit them. So they start with the big picture and they pick up then the little details. But I think historians start with all of the little things, and with the passage of time are able to step back and draw some universals. It doesn't take away anything from the individual stories. It just helps to, over time, put them into a larger perspective. So I think about the people in the LA fires. There are millions of individual stories there, and people have experienced those events differently, and had experienced different consequences of the fires. All of those stories are individually important, And in 20 years, there'll be somebody who'll be able to write back and figure out what this really means for the city of Los Angeles and for and for California and for climate and fire and all kinds of things. But it's only with the passage of time that we can understand what to have true meaning. And so I hope that there isn't a contradiction in the book. I think I'm trying to celebrate both the individual stories, the individual cities, the individual circumstances, and from those be able to draw some universalities as well. But I'd love to know what you think about that. Is there a contradiction?
Here's what I think. I think Jesus, Mother Teresa, and Martin Luther King all had their critics, and so you're never going to make everybody happy. So that's what I think.
You know what I think? To me, it's talking about exactly what I mean by this, the anthropological sense of history. And one of the things that I've run into in my life is that people have less of an inclination to understand history as a story of human beings. They would rather talk about it in terms of battles and dates and that sort of thing, because again, you keep touching on in different ways, but history is so multidisciplinary. So if you don't have a background that involves intellectual discipline and being able, the way I say to people all the time, the way I understand current events, because nowadays people are always saying, well, you got that from this channel or that channel. It's like, no, the way I understand current events is like constantly weaving it in with everything I've already come to understand in terms of how human beings tend to act and react in different circumstances. And what frightens me is that so many people do not seem to understand that as a way of understanding things. Yeah. Do you find that kind of frustration? Or I don't think guys and women tend to run into the same roadblocks, but anyway.
That's probably true. I wish I had a better answer on this one. I guess I try to understand people from the circumstances in which they come, I try to, keep an open mind and an open ear and listen as best I can. And sometimes that means keeping my opinions to myself. But
I don't mean, what I mean is, do you find that resistance of embracing history as an anthropological lens? Do you find resistance to that?
Well, I think that people often have bad experiences studying history in school. And one of the reasons for that is I think I think that's true. And then they hold that grudge against history and studying history for many, many years, decades even. Maybe it was a bad 7th grade history teacher and the results are, 25, 30, 40 years later, they're still angry. But I do think that history is easier to understand as we get older, that we have our own history and we have our own triumphs and our failures. We can see cause and effect in our own lives, and that helps us to understand history for other people and other cultures and other civilizations. Asking high school kids to do that is tough because they don't have enough of their own history yet to sort of see that complexity. And so I was talking with a person last night who hated history in school, hated history all the way through, and she's now probably in her mid-40s, early 50s, and she says, I'm finally getting interested in this stuff. I'm finally getting curious about it. And so I think part of it is just helping people understand that it's okay if you don't like history up till now, but keep an open mind, and that may change. And part of it's finding what kind of history might turn that orientation around.
Yes, that is a great answer, and spoken as a true teacher. And I'm so glad those kids get to have you to help them. get past their fears or their resentments. It just yeah, you're right. It probably has a lot to do with how you first, I mean, it probably has something to do with one's native curiosity, one's native character. But yeah, then you run up against who introduced you to this idea and that idea. And was it a path you were able to follow, or were you forced to follow one that made no sense to you? You know, yeah, that can be extraordinary. Yeah, history is probably the way I understand everything.
Well, it teaches us everything.
Exactly. Yeah. And I like that point about getting older. And yeah, like I say, we all bring our experience. I can remember, you reminded me of, because I've never forgotten this moment, freshman high school history, world history class. China had just exploded their first atomic bomb, and they did it over their own territory. And the teacher asked some question about the thing, and the woman next to me screams out. She was one of those that always had to be the first one to answer the question. She said, "Because they have too many people." And I just sort of looked at her with my mouth hanging open. It's like, yeah. Yeah, it just, you had to be there, I suppose, because it probably doesn't sound as funny as it is. But talk about bringing two separate sets of understanding to where you start. And yeah, and that guy, he was the teacher everybody loved to hate, if you know what I'm saying. Not a hated teacher. The teacher that you had to have the best story about why you hated him, which to me indicated how effective he was.
Hey, Derek, we'll need to
Yes.
wrap things up because I have
Yes.
another program to go to,
I
unfortunately. But
understand.
yeah, thanks so much for being here. Greatly appreciate it. Derek's actually going to come back and talk about his book again in a few months. So we'll have like a kind of a part two, and don't have the date just for that, but we'll square things away. Thanks, Brad and Patty, for co-hosting once again. Greatly appreciate Brad and Patty all the time you spend with us. Couldn't do this without you. And Derek, any final thoughts before we wrap things up?
I just want to again reiterate my appreciation for all of you and taking the time out of a Saturday to come and listen. Happy history reading.
All right. And
All right.
for anybody watching, I'll email out the link, but I probably won't be able to upload the program until tomorrow.
Thank
Okay,
you for
thanks, Derek.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
Patty.
Take
Thanks,
care.
Brad.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank
everybody.
you very
Bye-bye.
much, Eric. This is wonderful.
I appreciate it, Brad. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Take care.